My town has a history of special visitors. Submitted by Dogeman87. They come at night. They'll tell you they mean no harm, but that's a lie. At first, you will think they're human, and that's a lie, too. If you ask them what they're doing, they will tell you it's none of your business. If you ask them again, they'll make subtle threats. Those threats will become terrifyingly real if you push them any further. At first, there is no reason to doubt their legitimacy. They look like respectable folk. They wear nothing but the finest suits and dresses, and while that's a bit strange for a town in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, it's no reason for concern. Some people are old-fashioned that way. When I visited my sister in Pennsylvania last year, she told me about how the Amish do the same thing. For the most part, these people, things maybe a more accurate term, will not bother you if you leave them alone. Most of the time, they occupy themselves with tasks I do not understand. They destroy abandoned homes, burn parts of public gardens, raze unused farmland. Sometimes they encroach on private property. In those cases, people steer clear of them, because everyone knows what will happen if you get in their way. What are these things? I have no idea. I call them the breakers. Mostly because all they do is break stuff. I guess in that sense they aren't totally friendly, but they mostly go after places that are unoccupied. When they do target private property, it's owned by criminals or cheaters or just your everyday assholes. Occasionally they kill people, and when they do, it's always someone worse than the scum that ends up dead. The breakers do not come very often. I saw them only twice in the past year. The first time they destroyed an old mansion which had remained unoccupied for 12 years. It had belonged to the past mayor who had passed away from cancer. His family had not wanted to resell the house, and it has sat in disrepair ever since. The second time is why I'm writing this story. They took my mother. I filed a missing person report and did not expect much. Our sheriff doesn't stop by our town very often, and when he does, it's for a cup of coffee at his favorite joint down the street. His deputies and the local police department aren't much better. There are typically 3 or 4 officers in our town at a time, and they do little more than fiddle their thumbs and fill out paperwork. For anything to actually get done, you need to call the sheriff, and as I said, he doesn't tend to help much. So I was surprised when I got an email from the sheriff's office. I was even more surprised when it said he would meet me personally the next morning at 6 a.m. Early as hell for me, considering I'm a self-employed carpenter, but I didn't mind. I wanted any news I could get about my mother. My wife said she would hold down the fort if anyone called. She's great about stuff like that. If I ever need help with my job, she's always willing to step up. This, on top of caring for our young daughter and the house. When I reached the meeting spot, a little-known gazebo in Nebraska National Forest, I wasn't surprised to see I was alone. I'd gotten there 3 minutes early, and by an unspoken rule, the sheriff always arrived late to meetings. If you arrived late, though, he'd chew out your ass. I was not in the mood to deal with that. You might wonder why the meeting place wasn't a red flag. Why not meet at the coffee place? Or at least somewhere inside? Truthfully, I don't know. I think my thoughts were muddled then. I was so concerned about my mother that I would have given a kidney to find her, had the sheriff asked. When 6:15 came and went, I became a little worried. The sheriff was never this late. He also kept his promises, even if he was unreliable most of the time. He's a good man, really, despite what my portrayals may suggest. At 6:30 I decided to call. His office wasn't open, but he'd given me his cell in the email. I immediately got his voicemail. That was strange. I'd figured he would pick up if he'd asked to meet this early. I left my message and waited some more. When he didn't show up, I shrugged my shoulders and left. I couldn't wait around forever, after all, and he would surely reach out to me later. I got a confusing call around lunchtime that day. The sheriff told me that he didn't know what I was talking about. "What do you mean, you don't know?" I asked. "Did you forget about the meeting?" "Son, I ain't got any idea what you mean," he said. "I didn't have no meeting today. Sure as hell didn't schedule one that early." He paused. "Is this about your ma?" "It was supposed to be. We're still looking for her. Tell you what. I'll call you personally if we find anything out. That sound good to you?" I told him it did, and he hung up. Little did I know that he had already called off the search by then. Not that it mattered. I would only find that out later when it was too late. Nothing unusual happened for the rest of that day. Business was good, my wife was happy, my daughter entertained herself with a new Lego set we had bought her. She's totally obsessed with Legos. My wife insists she'll grow up to be an engineer. I have my doubts, but she does seem to have an aptitude for math. She's only in 3rd grade and is already good with exponents and fractions. Me? That's about as far as my math knowledge goes. I never made it past high school. The only one in my family to attend college was my uncle, and he became a lawyer. A pretty far cry from an engineer. I'm not sure where my daughter gets it. That evening we were all sitting at the dinner table when I heard a tapping at our window. I didn't think much of it. We have some trees in the backyard that scratch up against the house. There are also critters that like to climb on our roof and try to enter the attic. Sometimes they do, and then I have to get my hunting rifle while my wife distracts my daughter. Neither of them like guns. The tapping didn't stop. It kept coming back between minute-long intervals until my daughter started complaining. "Daddy, what's that noise?" she asked. "I dunno, honey. I'll check it out." Boy, was that a mistake. I knew that there was nothing outside the kitchen window, so I went into the living room to check. Up against the glass was a man with beady black eyes and a hawk-like nose. As I walked into the room, he lifted a long nailed finger and placed it against the glass. Needless to say, I was taken aback by this. I considered getting my rifle, but I figured that wasn't necessary. Instead, I approached the guy and told him to fuck off. He smiled back at me before tapping on the window again. I've dealt with a lot of weirdos in this town, and I'm usually good at getting rid of them. This guy wasn't budging. I whispered all kinds of threats and curses. Nothing worked. He kept smiling and tapping away. After a couple minutes, my wife called out to ask what was taking so long. I said there was something out there and that I was going to get my gun. That seemed to get the man's attention. He looked at me wide-eyed and shook his head. When he ran toward our front door, I had no choice but to follow him. I didn't want him pulling more shit. I spoke to him through the screen door. It locks, like our normal wooden door does, which is convenient when you want to keep strangers out. In this case, it was the only reason I didn't run upstairs and look for my Glock. A cousin had given it to me from a military friend. I suspect he really went through the black market. Either way, the gun has served me well the few times I've needed to use it. The man spoke first. "My name is..." I can't even attempt to write out what it actually was. It sounded like some ancient language, something far different from Greek or Latin, which I actually know a bit of from my lawyer uncle. "We know where your mother is." What? I didn't question the "we" he had used. I probably should have. I was too focused on the claim about my mother. "Meet us at 6:30 this time. Same spot. Do not be late. Once the day becomes too bright, we must leave." "What are you going on about?" I asked. But he was already gone. He'd slipped away like a rodent. I figured I knew what he meant. He'd been the one to send me that email the previous day. How the hell had he faked the sheriff's email address? And why had he set up the meeting if he hadn't planned on coming? I'm still not sure why he did it. Maybe you have an idea. I don't care, to be honest. I only care about what happened that next day. As promised, I arrived at 6:30 sharp. The man was already there. With him were 2 women and a younger man, all 3 of which were unnaturally tall. I'm rather short at 5'7", but I built up a lot of muscle from my job. I don't get intimidated easily. These women scared me. It was something in their eyes, some hint of madness or hunger or both. Why those 2 things came to mind are beyond me. They were also at least 6 feet tall. For those of you unfamiliar with imperial units, that's about 2 meters. And the younger man was a fucking behemoth. You know those pictures of Arnold Schwarzenegger where he looks like he's got muscle on his muscle? Imagine something like that. It wasn't quite as extreme, but it was close. The man that I had spoken with at my house didn't seem to notice my surprise. He merely pointed at the bench across from him. I sat down and tried not to stare at his friends. "I can tell you where your mother is," he said. "But we'll need a favor from you." "Anything," I said. "There are some places we cannot go. One of these is the graveyard outside your town. There is a tombstone there for your past mayor. We want you to destroy it." "You're kidding. You want me to defile a grave? I'm not a criminal." "Nonetheless, we need you to do it. You do want to find your mother, right?" I nodded. "Then you know what has to be done." Our meeting concluded on that note. It was only then that I noticed his clothes. He was wearing suit pants and a blazer. The women wore dresses that reminded me of an early 1900s ball. He bade me farewell and left. I knew then what he was. What they all were. I understood now why they were asking me to destroy a grave. I just didn't know what the mayor had done wrong. It was none of my concern. The dead would stay dead, and my mom was still alive. I imagined the late mayor would not be upset if he knew why I was about to desecrate his grave. He was a generous man, from what I've heard. That night I made my plans. I grabbed a few hammers from the garage and loaded my pickup. I told my wife I was going out for a late-night job. A friend had called. I sometimes do favors like that, so she didn't question it. She told me she'd leave some casserole for when I got home. There was no one at the graveyard at that hour. I had counted on it. Very few people go anyways, and they don't go at night. Who would? I waited anyways in my car. There was no sound at all, not even the rustling of an animal in the grass. On top of that, the darkness was total. The moon and stars, normally visible at that hour, were concealed by clouds. When I was convinced no one was around, I got out my hammers and flashlight. I'm not proud of what I did. Even under the circumstances, it was probably not right. Would I do it again, though? Absolutely. I would protect my family with my life if given a chance. It took some time, but I beat the mayor's tombstone to death. When I was done, it was little more than rubble. I figured it would be some time before anyone noticed, and just in case I'd worn my father's old boots. They were 3 sizes too large, and anyone trying to determine who had left those footprints would be hard-pressed to identify me. As for being spotted, I actually did go over to my friend's house. He had asked me to help him out the next day, but I told him I just wanted to get it done. He was pleased by my surprise visit, so much so that he tipped me 20 on top of the 50 he'd already paid. That pretty much never happens. When I got home that night, I saw her. My mom was sitting on our front porch, in the old rocking chair that she'd always used when she was reading a book. I practically ran out of my car toward her. I didn't notice until I was much closer that she was dead. It was obvious once I'd reached the front door. Her body had been propped up against the back of the chair. Her arms were limp, and her eyes lifeless. I broke down then. I screamed and cursed the breakers, promising them that they'd regret what they had done. I think I woke up half the street. By the time my wife had come out, I had gotten partial control of myself, and then I lost it again when she saw the body and screamed herself. The police came to pick it up an hour later. They had trouble getting her in the van because her bones were broken. All of them were, as it turned out. It was a cruel irony that I had not expected from the breakers, who for the most part, had been friendly to people in the past. The autopsy revealed that she had died just 2 hours before I found her. A bunch of forensics guys came in and couldn't find anything. The bones, too, they had no idea how they had been broken like that. There are a lot of bones in the human body, so breaking them all takes a ridiculous amount of effort. It had been, to quote the sheriff, the most methodical murder I've ever seen. A few days after her funeral, I found out my mom had meth in her system. I hadn't known her to do much more than smoke pot. Most people do around here. I was pretty surprised, and I wondered for a moment if that's why the breakers had killed her. But that didn't make any sense. The people they targeted were real pieces of shit. The last guy they killed was a rapist, and they didn't break all of his bones. They just slit his throat and dumped him where they usually did, right in front of the PD. No one would know it had been them if it weren't for an old man on his porch at that hour who recognized the old-fashioned Ford in the men in navy suits. I don't think I've gotten over my mother's death. I suspect I never will. Thinking about how she died makes me want to go out and murder all the breakers I can find. I haven't, though, because I know that I'd die before I even touched one. If they're capable of so many murders, then I don't know if they can ever be stopped. All I know is that they never target more than one person per family. For that, I'm grateful. What worries me, though, is the letter I got yesterday. It was in my mother's handwriting, so I knew immediately who had sent it. The letter said that there would be another job for me, and that if I don't comply all rules will be off. I hope to God that they don't make me do something I will regret.